So for this unit, we are covering two chapters, chapter 6 and chapter 7. And we're covering really two connected stories. So chapter 6 explains how a protest movement became a full revolution and how people made life-changing decisions about independence. And then chapter 7 picks up right after victory and asks, now that the United States exists, what kind of country is it going to be? So a key theme across both chapters is that freedom meant different things to different people. And the new nation had to decide whose freedom counted, how government power should work, and who should be included. So as you're going through, here are the learning objectives for for chapter 6 and for chapter 7. So I want to look at some major topics from both chapters in this little mini lecture. And I want you to realize the revolution didn't begin with a declaration. It began with armed conflict. And even before that Declaration of Independence went out, in April of 1775, British troops marched to two locations. They marched to Lexington and then on to Concord to seize Patriot supplies and arrest leaders. And the fighting that followed made the crisis feel irreversible. So suddenly reform seemed less realistic, and more colonists began to imagine separation. But you have to remember, independence was a huge risk. And the Second Continental Congress, so the second time some political leaders got together and had a meeting, it included delegates who still wanted negotiation and others who argued that once blood had been spilled, independence would be the only path and was the only path. So the early war also forced people to confront contradictions. If colonists were fighting for liberty, what about enslaved people? What about native nations? What about many colonists who didn't want war at all, those who remained loyal? So Congress is going to appoint George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. That army was not a professional force at first. Supplies were short, training was uneven, and Washington constantly begged colonies for more men and resources. Also, smallpox was a major factor. Disease affected morale and readiness, and Washington eventually relied on inoculation to keep the army alive and functioning. And by 1776, military looked grim. The British, it was and had the strongest army and navy in the world at the time. And it aimed to control New York and the Hudson River to cut off New England. And Washington's troops suffered major defeats and they ended up retreating. And then came a morale shift. Washington's surprise victories at Trenton and Princeton proved the army could fight. And that helped keep the Patriot cause alive when it could have collapsed. The Revolution also was a civil war. Loyalists, patriots, and people who tried to stay neutral lived side by side. Native nations faced pressure from both sides. Many believed Britain was more likely to limit colonial settlement, so many allied themselves with Great Britain, while others tried to stay neutral and were pushed into conflict anyway. And then for enslaved people, the war created dangerous opportunities. Lord Dunmore issued Dunmore's proclamation that promised freedom to enslaved people who joined the British cause. Some fled to the British, others fought with the Patriots, and sometimes with promises of freedom that were uneven or even delayed. The point is, people didn't choose sides because of ideology alone. They chose based on survival, local conditions, and who they thought would protect their families and futures. So some key turning points. One of those is Saratoga, and this is in 1777. And the American victory, that is what convinced France that the Patriots were a serious bet, and French recognition and support transformed the war into an international conflict. Foreign volunteers and training also mattered, so at Valley Forge, the army nearly fell apart from cold, hunger, and poor discipline, but leadership, training, and outside support helped rebuild the force. Turning to the home front, Women and families kept communities running. Women made clothing, provided supplies, raised funds, and in some cases served as spies, messengers, nurses, and even soldiers disguised as men. War wasn't only fought on battlefields. Then we see the war shifting. So from 1778 to 1781, fighting intensified in the South and along the frontier, and the war became very brutal, with civilian targeting and retaliatory violence. Eventually, Washington coordinated with French forces to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown, and the French Navy prevented British resupply, and Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781. That doesn't mean that we had peace. So we don't have that we don't have independence. We don't have independence in 1776 just because we declare it. We don't have independence in 1781 just because Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. We do not get independence until the Treaty of Paris is signed and everyone kind of agrees on it. And that doesn't happen until 1783. So although the Treaty of Paris does recognize U.S. independence and grants huge territory, one striking factor is that Native allies were not consulted at all. So this new nation expanded on paper, even though Native peoples still lived on those lands. And that unresolved reality becomes a major aftershock of independence. So how do we deal with all of that? So after the war, the United States faced a lot of threats. We had debt, we had instability, we had a weak central power under the Articles of Confederation, and that led to another meeting, another constitutional convention of 1781. And this is where delegates, and a lot of those, well, all of them were elite white men who owned property. And they met in secret, and they're going to reframe the government. We are going to move from the Articles of Confederation, which kind of treat all the colonies as like friends, to now what we are going to see as states who have more representation and who are connected by laws. They debated representation and created compromises like a bicameral legislature and the three-fifths formula, while also protecting slavery, where Southern delegates mandated it. Ratification triggered a fierce debate, though. So Federalists, those are who, for this new Constitution, they wanted a stronger national government, and anti-Federalists who were against the Constitution as it was written feared tyranny and demanded protections. And so they had a compromise, and that became the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And you're going to read more about that. So Washington's administration, what he does is he set up departments, courts, and a new federal structure. Then Alexander Hamilton launched an economic agenda, funding the national debt, assuming state debt, creating a national bank, and raising revenue through tariffs and excise taxes like the whiskey tax. These policies, what they do is they're going to help stabilize the government and stabilize the economy and try to stimulate the economy and get us out of debt, but it creates a lot of conflict, and crisis events followed. Neutrality struggles and treaties overseas, yellow fever in Philadelphia, and the Whiskey Rebellion, which Washington suppressed, showing federal power could be enforced under this new Constitution. It couldn't be enforced under the Articles of Confederation. So by the late 1790s, politics hardened into a first-party system. Under John Adams, the XYZ affair increased tensions with France. The Alien and Sedition Acts attempted to control dissent, provoking backlash, and it ended up resulting in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Finally, the election of 1800 resulted in a very peaceful transfer of power, one of the most important precedents of the early republic. So chapter 6 and 7 are connected arc, really. We have this revolution creates independence, but independence creates new political battles. And the big question that remains is, when Americans said liberty, who did they mean? And who was left out? So as you're going through, I just pose these questions for you to kind of like think like a historian as you're moving through these two chapters. Here's some key terms for you to look at. These are like the big major themes that you're going to hear and read about as you're going through chapter 6 and 7. And you'll dive more into these different rebellions. You'll dive more into Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but pay attention to these as you move through chapter 6 and 7. Make sure you complete the Canvas assignments before moving on to the Achieve assignments.